and welcome to this edition of Represent NYC on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Councilmember Helen Rosenthal, and I represent the Upper West Side in the New York City Council. Today we'll be discussing a form of tenant harassment known as construction as harassment, which is impacting New Yorkers across the city. We'll also be learning how a coalition of community organizations, legal services groups, and local elected officials called Stand for Tenant Safety has come together to fight this form of harassment. And we'll hear about the legislative steps that the New York City Council has taken to protect tenants' rights and tenant safety. Joining me today is Susan Schwartz, a tenant who has experienced construction as harassment firsthand and has proven to be a champion for her neighbors fighting back against it. Susan has worked with my staff for years on tenants' rights issues. Dan Evans, a tenant organizer with Goddard Riverside Law Project, who has helped to build the Stand for Tenant Safety Coalition and tirelessly advocated for tenants' rights. And Jane Lee, an attorney at the Urban Justice Center's Community Development Project, who has defended tenants against predatory actions from their landlords. Thank you all very much for being here today. This is an incredibly important topic. As I've said before, about 75 or 80% of the constituent work we do in the office has to do with tenant harassment, and construction as harassment is a particularly vile form. Dan, if you could start by explaining what it is and sort of what the factors have been in its emergence.
Yeah, of course. So I think before getting to construction as harassment, just harassment generally is any action by a landlord or an agent of the landlord that's intended to disturb the peace or privacy or quiet enjoyment of a tenant's occupancy of their home, or has the intended effect of getting the tenant to vacate their home on their own volition. And for decades, we've seen harassment take the form of baseless or frivolous lawsuits, repeated buyout offers, discontinuance of essential services. And more recently, we've started to see construction emerge as a form of harassment. And that takes the form of if a landlord has, let's say a vacant unit in a building, and there happens to be a rent-stabilized tenant or a rent-regulated tenant living next door to that vacant unit, the landlord will do construction at all hours of the day, either without permits or with improper permits. And it can result in things like collapsed ceilings, lead-contaminated dust being exposed throughout the hallways and the common areas of the building, debris throughout the building, and really it means the tenants that live in the building are living in an active construction zone.
So I see you nodding knowingly, Susan. Tell us about your experience with this and what occurred in your home and your building.
It's so hard to pick any one example, but I could start with the apartment next door to me. I'm a rent-stabilized tenant. I've lived in my building for 32 years in my apartment. When I moved in, there are 303 units. All of them were rent-stabilized. Now we're down to about 125.
A third.
Yes. So in the past 5 years, the landlord has renovated over 100 apartments. Those are all gut renovations, all of them done without a permit. All of them done without a permit. In January of 2015, my next door neighbor moved out, and I took a look at the apartment, said goodbye, I'm sorry you're leaving, and thought this won't be bad this time because there have already been several gut renovations in here. I was so wrong. So in February, the jackhammer and the sledgehammer started. They took the floor down to dirt. They took the walls down to the studs. They took out everything in the bathroom with the jackhammer. They worked Monday through Saturday, 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., and there was no permit. And at about the same time, the building started a building-wide hallway renovation that involved electrical work being done by unlicensed workers, structural work, again, no permits, and no tenant protection plan. But there was none necessary because when they finally did get a permit, it said the building was unoccupied. So we managed to get a stop work order in June of 2015, and I have to say kudos to your office. The way this all started was I remember coming into your office and talking to Anna Gago and you and saying, do I have any rights? And you said, you bet you do. And so now I know all about my rights. So we managed to get the building marshals to come in and issue a stop work order. And bit by bit, we've had some progress, but it's been very upsetting. The building-wide hallway renovation that was stopped in June, it took the building until October to get a permit for that work. And it still said that the building was unoccupied. Fast forward to November of 2015, the building decided to do some renovation work on the 19th floor and taped closed the door of an elderly woman who's disabled with painter's tape while she was in her apartment, and they took sledgehammers to the ceiling out in front of her apartment, and asbestos rained down. And we managed to get a stop work order for that, but it just continues.
Jane, and we're all sitting here feeling horrified about what you're just describing. Why is it so difficult to get the attention of the buildings department and get them to issue the stop work orders or to require a building owner to play by the rules?
Right, so when tenants come to us with these problems, the first thing that we try to tell them, or we do tell them, is to call 311, get the Department of Buildings out there to do an inspection. The issue is that tenants can then sometimes wait over a month on average to get this inspection, and oftentimes the landlord is able to finish that discrete project that they're doing that has been unpermitted, and then we can't get the violation on record. So even if there is a case, if the tenants are lucky to have legal counsel, they're going to have a hard time proving that the landlord did this work illegally. Furthermore, oftentimes landlords apply for permits, they're falsifying information, they've done illegal things in the past, but the Department of Buildings, either doesn't have the resources or have the willpower to make sure that all of the submitted information is correct, and therefore the tenants are left in this precarious position where they're fending for themselves, they're not affirmatively aware of what their rights are, and so it's a whole cycle that the landlords are able to exploit and push out tenants from majority rent-regulated apartments.
Which gets to the point of the affordable housing crisis. Preserving our affordable housing, rent-controlled, rent-regulated apartments is critical. I mean, the mayor has said that he wants to preserve 120,000 units and build 80,000 new ones, and yet this is going on. Do you have a sense with your work about what portion of deregulation happens through construction as harassment?
I can't put a specific number on it, but our office sees new clients every Thursday, and every Thursday it seems we have tenants coming in complaining that their neighbors have moved out for whatever reason, and the landlord is gut renovating their apartments and effectively deregulating those units. And when you talk about deregulation, step one is to get the tenant out. As soon as the tenant's out, that's when the landlord can start doing renovations and construction inside the apartment to bring it above the deregulation threshold. And then we've lost that unit, that piece of affordable housing.
It seems like a confluence of events has brought us to this point in time. Market rates have gone out the door. And because it's been a while since we set the price for deregulation, but also for the base price of the rent, we're getting closer and closer to the 2,700 mark. So between those two things, you could see how a landlord thinks, they're that close and they're just gonna move fast to get somebody out. And it gets us to thinking about the wonderful package of legislation that your coalition, Jane and Dan, have brought to the City Council. Could you talk a little bit about what the Stand for Tenant Safety legislative package is? Jane, if you could take the first crack at it.
So the Stand for Tenant Safety Coalition's legislative package is a package of 12 bills that tenants, advocates, and legal services organizations have been pushing to pass for the last 3 years. And with the support of supportive council members, we think we're very close. But basically, it's an effort to reform the Department of Buildings and to penalize landlords that are bad actors, landlords and contractors that are bad actors. So the pieces of the legislation fall into several buckets. The first bucket is to inform tenants of their rights, to ensure that tenant protection plans are available to tenants. A second piece is to raise fines for landlords who, for example, violate stop work orders or have exhibited poor behavior in the past. A third piece is to give DOB tools to respond to tenants who complain about dangerous conditions in their apartment, allow them to liaise with other government agencies to strengthen enforcement. And then the last piece is to increase oversight of people who have exhibited poor behavior, and then possibly take away buildings from landlords who flagrantly violate the law.
I have to say, I love this package of bills because it really, over the last 3.5 years, as I say, people come into our office and talk about these issues, and this package is going to help address many of the problems. So I'm going to brag for a second. My bill, which is one of the 12, tries to address the issue that Susan just raised, which is this notion of building owners starting to do work without a permit or saying that the building is unoccupied. So one of the things it would do is require that on the work permit itself, there be a box that the owner has to check off, affirmatively saying whether or not the building is occupied. And that way, someone like Susan walking by could say, this is interesting. It seems to note that, it's not occupied, but I live here. So we could catch that a lot faster. And I'm so sorry, but I'm just so proud of this. Someone in my office, my chief of staff, came up with this idea. We also have a bill that's hopefully traveling along with Stand for Tenant Safety that would create an Office of the Tenant Advocate in the Department of Buildings. Because one of the things we found is that HPD is responsible for the harassment issues, and yet so many of the violations have to do with the Department of Buildings. And so the idea is that we force DOB to be part of the conversation in looking out for the tenants as well. I mean, I think the Department of Buildings does an amazing job with making sure that buildings are superstructures that are going up, that they're built safely, and everyone has to cross every T and dot every I. But where they don't have the tools they need is exactly on these issues. So just wanted to brag that for a second. Dan, you've been integral to this. Can you talk about how the coalition came together and with an eye toward sort of explaining how this affects people throughout the city from the Upper West Side to, Flatbush?
Sure, absolutely, and it's tenants like Susan that really drove the campaign. And especially groups like St. Nick's Alliance and Cooper Square Committee and the Urban Justice Center, tenants were reporting at various housing rights organizations that they were seeing this construction as a form of harassment. And the groups I mentioned were really instrumental in getting a number of groups that make up the coalition at the table. And when we were at the table together, we realized that it really is not a, neighborhood by neighborhood issue, it's a citywide issue. And it really was a campaign that was driven by tenants and tenant leaders.
Thank you. And how many members of the coalition are there? I'm seeing in my mind's eye the page, there must be at least 20.
Yeah, we have about 30.
Great.
Organizations across the city that are part of the coalition.
And Susan, have you looked at this legislation? Do you feel like it would address many of the issues?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I went to a great presentation in February at the Manhattan Borough President's Office, put on by the coalition, and they went through all of it. It was really moving to see the tenants come out and talk about, the help that we feel this will be providing. I'm a member of CB7, as you know,
Yeah.
and on the Housing Committee, and we, at the urging of the Manhattan Borough President, we went back to the Community Board and passed a resolution in April supporting this legislation, and did a very heart-wrenching presentation, I'd like to think, about with demonstrations, visual aids of what we face every day in our building.
Wait, but that was just for people on the Upper West Side when it was from Community Board 7.
That was for our district
Wow.
to go ahead and say, please go forth, and CB7's Housing Committee, and then CB7 entirely supports this and wants to see this legislation passed. So yeah, we went through it at the Community Board meeting. We went through every piece of legislation and presented it all. And we're really, fully
I think
supportive
Upper
of this.
West Siders as a whole would be surprised. I mean, if you don't mind telling like one or two of the stories, I think Upper West Siders would be surprised at what goes on in their neighboring building.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, that's one of the things we face every day is you think it's 71st and Broadway where I live, like that, how could this be happening?
Yeah.
I mean, we have 311 is a tremendous asset for us, and our tenants call a lot. The DOB does not like getting calls from our building, but that's too bad because that's how the system's supposed to work. Although we've all had the experience of being told that they'll be there in 40 days. I've actually been told that when I call 311, they'll be there in 60 days. That's 60. And I'm thinking, Noah and the Ark, 40 days, you're going to come in 60 days? By that point, it won't be visible.
Well, because a lot of the things that you talk about is there's only one elevator. Like there are usually 3, but 2 aren't working, so there's one elevator.
So in our building, we have racked up, I'm not proud to say, almost 100 violations for our elevators in the last 3 years. That's a lot. That's double the number of our sister building on 72nd Street, owned by the same landlord. Something's very wrong with our elevators. We've all been in dangerous situations with them. So now they've begun a project of renovating the elevators. And there are occasions where we're down to 1 elevator and that elevator doesn't work. It's a 20-story building. We've got senior citizens. We've got disabled people. And that's not going to work. It's just
And
not.
also when you're sharing, when they're doing construction, you're sharing
The elevator with the workers. So
and they've got debris.
Debris, absolutely.
Right.
And speaking of debris, there's a change in our building. So the trash, which had been collected on every tenant floors, was moved 2 years ago, right after we started the tenant association. It was moved to the basement. So there are 2 passenger elevators that open up in the basement and take you to the trash room. And last year in June, the building did a demolition of these 2 storage rooms directly across from those passenger elevators in the basement with jackhammers. The workers had no masks on. The asbestos was flying everywhere. And we managed to get a stop work order from the Department of Environmental Protection, but that was after the asbestos had been disturbed and disseminated through the whole building via the passenger elevators. And it's that kind of thing that just goes on all the time. And as you say, people would be shocked to hear this is happening. I wanted to do a study in my building to see the gut renovations. As I said, over 100 apartments have been gut renovated in the past 3 to 5 years. I wanted to do a study to see, was it only around apartments where they're rent stabilized? Because I think that's what's happening. The facade work that was done in the northern part of the building, there's 1 remaining rent stabilized tenant on the penthouse level. He's got a great apartment. He's a senior citizen. He has every right to be there. He's been there 40 years. It was unbelievable what they did to this tenant with construction on the facade, all in the name of local 11 law work.
Right. I mean, what seemed to be remarkable, and I remember talking to the commissioner about this, was they seemed to be repairing the facade work outside this apartment over and over and over and over again.
Yes.
And my question to him was, isn't there some point at which you say it should be fixed by now, but yet they're still giving yet another work permit because, the line is, oh, it hasn't been fixed yet, we need another work permit. I mean, I find that mind-numbing. And it was so clearly directed at this tenant.
Yeah.
And, one of the bills, and Jane, we started talking about this a little bit beforehand, but one of the bills that's having a hard time going through, because you have to get approval, everyone needs to come to an agreement on it, is the one that would address Susan's issue directly. No, there's only 1 elevator now, and both the workers are on it and the passengers. Or no, right now you have to come and see what's being demolished, and she gets, a note from 311, it'll be 60 days later.
Right, so we are seeking what we call real-time enforcement. basically that the DOB respond to tenant complaints in a timely manner and prioritize the ones that seem most serious, like if there's a collapsed ceiling or if the landlord has taken away the staircase, things that tenants often come to us with, that the Department of Buildings allocates the proper resources in order to respond to those complaints. I don't remember the exact number, but I think you can count on like two hands the number of inspectors that the Department of Buildings has to respond to these issues, and that's clearly not enough. So I think it's a matter of making it a budget priority and empowering the Department of Buildings to respond to these complaints and making them an ally of the tenants instead of being another bureaucracy to navigate. The Department of Buildings should be a resource and a government agency that you can turn to help you deal with these problems.
And to be fair, because I've talked with the commissioner about this issue too, I think you'd have to see, part of their problem is filling vacancies. So a lot of times they do have the budget for it, but it's hard to find people who are willing to take this job at this salary versus the private sector. And the commissioner is constantly telling me about how people come into the Department of Buildings as like a training job. And once they really get good at it and know what they're doing, the private sector hires them for a lot more money. And I think that's part of the problem too, realistically. So there's a question of vacancies versus do they have money in the budget? I'm with you 1,000%.
Yeah, I guess they need to have better retention programs and better training programs to bring people in the pipeline. The tenants really shouldn't be the ones that are suffering because of, this management issue.
And, the other sort of challenge in the situation that Susan just brought up is that it was DEP that had to come out and issue the violation on asbestos. So 311 has to know that this goes to DEP, not DOB. And what I still can't figure out, because I'm always trying to pull back the onion on this, the layers of the onion on this, is do they talk to each other?
Never.
DEP and DOB. I mean, on DOB's website and HPD's website, one of the nice things is you can look up by your address and see what's going on. Can't do that with DEP, can't do it with DOH, where we call about the mold problems.
Right, so one thing we counsel tenants to do is to say certain keywords so that hopefully the 311 operator will pick up on. If there's lead dust, we tell them to emphasize the fact that they have small children. Yes. One of the bills seeks to address the interagency the problems with communications between the government agencies, and it would create an interagency task force so that all of the agencies that have a say in the habitability of an apartment, whether that be environmental concerns, health concerns, structural concerns, et cetera, come to the table and troubleshoot both systemic issues that plague the agencies and also focus on certain cases, certain buildings that are having a hard time overcoming the constructionist harassment issues.
So I'm with you 1,000%. I have to say though, I have a fantasy bill. It hasn't moved forward yet, but a piece of legislation I'm working on that would require the city to have on its website where you could type in your address and see what's happening with the different agencies. I mean, Susan should be able to type in her address and find out what's happening with the DEP violation, the DOH violation, DOB, HPD, by address. And it sort of gets to the issue of how do you think about city government as silos of agencies, and they're each in their own world, or do you think about it from the residents' point of view and how government responds or deals with things. And that's, it's a tough question that I think, good government people who want to run government well think about it all the time. It's something we certainly have discussed in the council and, with our lawyers. But I got to tell you, when I'm in the office and hearing from constituents, why is it that you have to come to your council member's office to figure out, oh, that's a DEP thing, not a DOB thing, and we'll follow it up for you. I think that's...
But we're lucky to have such a great
I did not
resourceful
pay you to
staff.
say that, but thank you.
The issue of the fines not being
Yeah.
collected is something else that's very, very frustrating. So when you finally do get through the website and you take a look at the fines and the violations have been issued, it's mind-boggling why they're not being collected.
So again, I have another piece of legislation that I would like to move through the process because that's exactly right. And we discovered that, Dan, I think we talked about that with Airbnb, that there are so many fines out there, but then they're not collected. So how can you track Department of Buildings violation number through the system, through to the Office of Trials and Administration, through to the Department of Finance, to see what the judgment is by oath and whether or not certain judges, or if judges are bundling violations and maybe getting rid of what should be a bunch of fines. So a landlord comes in and says, oh yeah, well, I fixed the boiler. Oh, okay, then I'm not going to give you this additive $100,000 worth of fines, pay $5,000. And it may or may not even be true because the tenant doesn't know that that trial is happening. So that's another thing where we have to have a system that exposes that issue. And now I'm being told that we're about to go over. But Dan, I just want to ask you real quickly, can you talk to our viewers about what they can do to help out? Should they be calling their council members? Is their phone number, a website?
Yeah, absolutely. So step one is to organize. If you live in a residential apartment building, start a tenants association. If you have neighbors that are experiencing the same issues, block association. There is strength in numbers. Contact your local elected official. Contact your local housing rights organization. Ironically enough, call 311. And you can also join STS. We have lots of press events and rallies. Come make your voice heard. You can find all of our information at standfortenantsafety.com.
Great, great. Well, unfortunately, it's time for us to wrap up. I really appreciate this conversation. You guys are deep in it. And thank you for all your advocacy. I want to thank all of my guests for being here today. On behalf of all residents of New York City, thank you so much for the work you're doing to protect tenants' rights. So in the City Council, I'll be pushing for passage of the important tenant protection bills that we discussed here today, along with my colleagues. And thank you for watching Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Goodbye.